Today we are delighted to have as our guest speaker the Right Honourable Diane Abbott MP, Shadow Home Secretary, who's a long-standing member of the NUJ, I'm pleased to say. She preceded me at Thames Television as a journalist in the early 1980s. We go back a long way. We're in the Black Media Workers Association together, which paved the way for Channel 4 in the black sections, Labour Party black sections, which one of the pinnacles of our success was getting the 4 black MPs elected, or our members who were candidates elected in 1987. And Diane needs to be congratulated in lasting 30 years in Parliament and being the first black woman. She'll also be the first black person as Home Secretary, shortly, we hope. Not just for this country, but for the whole of Western Europe. And I think that that will be a major achievement for us. Diane's going to talk about black people in broadcasting. She was the victim, the subject of appalling abuse during the general election, which was both misogynist and racist. Unprecedented, never seen anything like it. But, they wouldn't have attacked Diane if she wasn't someone they fear. Because she is a formidable parliamentarian, a formidable politician, and they really are scared not just of Jeremy Corbyn as a true socialist being elected as Prime Minister, but having Diane Abbott as our Home Secretary. But I'm delighted that she's there. I'm sure you're going to give her a wonderful round of applause in a moment. Just let me say a bit about Claudia Jones. This was also an incredible black woman from Trinidad. She was an avowed communist. She was a fighter against racism all her life. Her life was cut short, unfortunately. She helped found Carnival. She wasn't the mother of Carnival. She was one of the people that laid the paving stones for that wonderful event. And, of course, in 1958, she founded a black newspaper called the West Indian Gazette. It wasn't the first, actually. That was a paper called Colonial News. But she was a pioneer in so many different aspects. And she once said, "People without a voice are lambs to the slaughter." And she gave us a voice with that newspaper. And with that introduction, may I introduce the next Home Secretary of Great Britain, Diane Abbott.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, comrades, good evening. Oh no, I must do better than that. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, comrades, good evening. Good evening. It's a privilege to be asked to deliver the Claudia Jones Lecture. Let me begin by talking about issues in relation to race and the media generally. And the first thing to say that now, in the 21st century, 2017, the interaction between media and politics and society has never been more important. Because actually, we live in a time where people, it's the 24-hour news cycle. And so much of the media we see is increasingly turbocharged. You have to have a news story for every bulletin. And I think the pressure to have a news story for every bulletin and the emergence of online, where things aren't necessarily checked or capable of being checked, means that the sort of fact-checking that went on in journalism when I first became a journalist no longer exists. And so you can just get swept away on a fallacious story, and it takes days, if not weeks, to understand what the facts were. But the reason the interaction between media and politics and society is so important is because media affects politics, politics affects media, and they both affect society. And media affects how the wider society sees people of colour, but it also affects how we see ourselves. So one of the problems is the slanted way some coverage presents. And let's not talk about race for a second. Let's think about Brexit. That was the most extraordinarily misleading political coverage. The media wrote it up in terms of the internal divisions in the Conservative Party. And I don't think, and I think many leading people in the media would say this, that it actually offered the British people the best explanation or the best understanding of what was at stake. So Brexit, I think, was an example of the media over-sensationalising, over-trivialising a subject which is this country's future and our children's future. But if you now move to looking at the question of the media and people of colour, there is a very sad history of stories around race issues finding their way into the tabloids, finding their way into broadsheet papers, and finding their way into broadcast media, which are wholly misleading. So, for instance, you'll all have seen in the last couple of days this story, which I think was the Telegraph splash initially, but it's been all over the BBC, about how Cambridge University wants to drop white authors. Now, if you actually look into that story, no one is suggesting that Cambridge University should drop white authors. What is being suggested is that the syllabus, particularly the English syllabus, should look at a wider range of authors. And that must be right in a university which is a global university, when we have so many extraordinary writers internationally. But instead of framing it as a positive story about how the curriculum at Cambridge, Oxford and anywhere else actually can step up to our globalised environment, it becomes a very negative story, and some poor young woman has found her picture on every front page as the person that wants to get white authors dropped. A few months ago, we had a story which I think the Times led on, but again found itself in broadcast media, which was about Muslim foster parents. And if you actually read that original Times story, and even some of the broadcast media coverage, you'd have got a totally false idea about the facts. It happened that the natural mother of the child that had been fostered herself had Muslims in her family. And so her objections, or her supposed objections, to her child being fostered by Muslim foster parents wasn't necessarily based in the fact that the child was, as the Times said it, a Christian. And yet that's what was projected. And what struck me about that story as it unfolded is you were invited to think that the very idea of Muslims being foster parents was somehow strange and was somehow something that should be questioned. There was another story which broke in The Sun and was eventually reflected in broadcast coverage, which really was about child sexual abuse scandals in Rotherham. The Sun ran an article by a colleague and a friend, Sarah Champion, but they headlined it, or the top line was, "We have a problem with Asian men raping white women." Now, again, if you examine the story, certainly the way the Sun chose to headline it, rather than necessarily the content that Sarah Champion wrote, it's quite tendentious. Child sex abuse is a problem in every community. What they call street grooming, where men target young women and children who are out on the street, groom them by giving them drink and drugs and claiming they're their boyfriend, and then abusing them and pimping them out is not a brand new phenomenon, not at all. I mean, this grooming of girls who are on the street happens not just in Rotherham, it happens in London, it happens in many cities. But the Sun was inviting you to think that street grooming in Rotherham was a brand new phenomenon, that it was something that was a particular issue with Asian men, and that it was a particular issue with Asian men and white girls. Now, every aspect of that was wrong. I mean, it's not simply not the case that it's only Asian men that target and groom girls who are out on the street. And it's also simply not the case that it's only white girls that get targeted, groomed, and abused. The reason that the Rotherham case had that dimension is the demographics of Rotherham. But if you come to London, you'll find, tragically, there's a range of men abusing young girls, and young girls from a range of backgrounds being abused. But that sensationalist and tendentious coverage doesn't help dealing with a real social ill and serves to stigmatise minority communities. And so in 2017, when we're supposed to have moved on in terms of race, when some people would argue we're in a post-racial era, I don't think a week goes past where we don't see a news story around racial issues which is tendentious and finds itself taken up by the broadcast media. And the steady drumbeat of those sorts of stories must necessarily affect how the society sees people of colour and how we see ourselves. So that's the context in which I deliver my remarks tonight. I have a history of working in the media that goes back over 30 years. Some people think I'm an MP that does a little bit of media on the side. I was actually a television journalist who became a Member of Parliament. I started off working for what was then the London regional television station, Thames Television. I worked on their early evening news show. I went from Thames to the ITV breakfast programme, TVAM. And although I left broadcast media, I then, before I became a Member of Parliament, worked as a press officer for the old Greater London Council. And so I have an interest and involvement with the media which goes back. And of course, when I joined Thames Television, there were hardly any people of colour there at all. I think there was one other reporter in the newsroom. And then I went on to TVAM. It was the same thing. Now, I have an instinct that when I find myself facing what I think are wrongs and social injustice, I always endeavour to organise. So what I did, faced with finding myself in a broadcast media world which was virtually all white, I mean, Trevor McDonald was around then. I can't really think of many more people. Even Trevor Phillips, who was just starting out his career. So faced with a media environment which is virtually all white, I decided to organise. And myself, and somebody that some of you may know, a journalist called Mike Phillips, who's actually Trevor Phillips' brother, we set up the Black Media Workers Association. And we got support for what was the predecessor union of BEC2, the union called the Film Technicians Union, the ACTT. They were actually very helpful and positive, and we got support from the NUJ. And we had 3 strands of activity. We compiled a guide to all the black people working in the media, black and Asian people working in the media, as you might imagine, it wasn't exactly a 10-volume production. It was a slim booklet, but at least it was the name and contact details for every black and minority ethnic person working in the media. Because one of the things we found when we started to ask television companies about why they employed so few people of colour was that they would say, well, we don't know anybody, nobody applies. So we thought if we provided a guide, that might help. So we did a guide. We also helped set up a course, like a foundation course, targeted at black and minority ethnic would-be journalists. We did it, I think it was what was then the Polytechnic of Central London. And we also tried to bring people together and to lobby through the unions on issues of diversity and representation. So nothing that's said about diversity and representation now is new to me. In the end, I went into full-time politics as a Member of Parliament, and the organisation no longer exists in that form. But it was useful for me because it meant I met everybody that was either in broadcast media or wanting to go into broadcast media, and it gave me a reasonable understanding of the issues. And the main thing I would say is that all too often people think of representation in broadcast media around how many presenters there are, and people even think of their own career in broadcast media in terms of becoming a presenter, whether it's a television presenter or a radio presenter. But actually, the real power lies behind the cameras. And what I notice watching television news and television programs is that although there are many more black and brown faces now than I would have seen when I first started over 30 years ago, when you walk into newsrooms, and I often have to walk into the BBC newsroom across the road at Full Millbank, or the new BBC building, New Broadcasting House, or ITV, the striking thing to me is how few black and brown faces you see in television and radio newsrooms. And even more striking, if you start to examine who are in the senior roles, who are the gatekeepers, you see very few black or brown faces. So what I would say, that as well as arguing and campaigning for more and better jobs for NUJ members, we have to keep our eyes on the prize. And the prize is to have diverse representation amongst those people who actually make the decisions about what goes on air, who actually make the decisions about how those stories are framed. Because frankly, a television news presenter, I mean, they may fiddle with the script, but they don't necessarily get to choose which story is in the running order, how it's treated. It's the people behind the scenes, it's the directors, it's the producers, it's the editor, it's the head of news, it's the head of current affairs who make those decisions. And when you look at our media institutions, you will find that those layers of management are not very much more diverse, as I say, as when I first entered the media at the end of the 1970s. So it's important to look at the backroom roles as well as the front of camera roles. It's also important, actually, I think, to look at technicians, cameramen, sound. I mean, they're not necessarily NUJ members, but I think it's important. And again, it's very striking to me how rare it is, because I often, much of the media I do nowadays is just straightforward news and current affairs. And it's striking to me, in 2017, how few black and minority ethnic cameramen or sound men or lighting people you see. That's not because there aren't people coming through the system with the skills. We have to examine that as well. So what can we do all these years later, when some of us started raising these issues? Well, first of all, we have to look at the issue of recruitment. And one thing which I think has set us back is the rise of unpaid internships. Because the truth is, whether you're an ordinary would-be media worker who is black or white, if you come from an ordinary background, unpaid internships are a barrier to entry. Because in order to take up an unpaid internship, generally you have to live in London, because most of the big media organisations are here in London. And you certainly have to be able to afford to live on thin air. My first job at Thames Television was as a researcher, and I'm absolutely confident that that job today would be filled by an unpaid intern. It was a very basic level, basic entry television job. And so that route in through entry-level jobs no longer exists, it seems to me. It's all about where they possibly can using unpaid interns. The other thing is the extent to which employment in broadcast media is about who you know. As many of you will know, I spent 12 years doing This Week with Andrew Neil, very well-known television presenter. And Andrew Neil and I don't agree on much, but I remember one day him saying to me as we were waiting to go on air, he said, "Do you know what?" he said to me. And what you have to understand is Andrew Neil comes from quite a low middle class family in Paisley in Scotland. He said to me, "You know what, Diane?" He said, "If you and I were starting out today, there's no way we could get where we have gone, because nowadays it's all about who you know." And when I started, I knew nobody. And he's right. In some ways, the informality and the insecure nature of employment in media, particularly broadcast media, masks the fact that it's more about who you know, I think, than it's ever been. That's why I can walk into a BBC newsroom and the kind of demographics of it. And I suppose if I was able to go around with a questionnaire, the class representation of it is much what it was 30-odd years ago. So we have to look at recruitment. We have to look at routes into employment. We have to fight for paid employment, even at the entry level. We have to fight for secure employment. That's very difficult in the current climate. But there's no question in my mind that if you don't have any sense of job security, it's much harder to stand up against unfair working practices. We also, the big media organisations also need to link directly with higher education institutions where they're likely to be able to recruit more diverse applicants, whether it's in front of the camera, whether it's behind the camera, or whether it's as technicians. There's still a tendency for independents, big companies to recruit people from the Russell Group universities. I remember doing a program. It was a program. It's one of those reality TV shows, and it was quite low key compared to most reality TV shows. I was learning to play the piano, but they had to film me at home for several weeks, and then finally they filmed me in Jamaica, and the reason they did that was because the reason I wanted to play the piano because I had an uncle in Jamaica who loved keyboard music. And so the idea was I learned to play, then I went to Jamaica, and they filmed me playing in front of him, and so on. So after a week or so, I realised the entire team around me, the researcher, the director, the camera people, were white. So I said in the politest way I could manage, isn't there anybody, given that there's this Caribbean element, this was my way into this argument, given there's this Caribbean element in this show, is there no way to have a little bit of diversity in the team? And so they were like, all right. And so the company went to some effort to try and recruit a researcher of colour. And when they'd gone through that process the director said to me, do you know, I interviewed all these people, and you know, they were really good. They were really bright. It was really amazing. And I thought, but this is 21st century. And you're telling me that it's amazing to be able to find people of colour who can actually do so. It's actually a basic level thing in broadcast journalism, being the researcher. And it just struck me that after all these years, the media is still a kind of a bubble where people work with people like themselves, recruit people like themselves, and have to be reminded of the fact that actually they're, in many cases, working and recruiting one of the most diverse cities in the world. So I think it's about entry, it's about routes into employment. It's about also trying to organise to make newspapers and broadcast media aware of what people think of their coverage. Most people don't know that if you ring up the BBC and you complain about something, they actually make a note of it. And I've always felt that there should be a more concerted effort by concerned people, people of colour and everybody else, to tell people what they feel about some of the stories and some of the way the stories are projected. So I think it's about employment. I think it's about making our views felt. The one good and important thing that has happened since I first entered the media is the rise of online media and Facebook and Twitter. And although Facebook and Twitter can be the vehicles for quite unpleasant abuse, they're also a vehicle by which you can put out different perspectives, different views, different ideas, and we need to use the world of online to put out our perspective and our stories. So it's employment, it's making our views felt, it's using the world of online to put out our stories, it's remembering that you just can't shrug off broadcast media, because broadcast media, and the media generally, infects the whole society. So in closing, because I want to be able to take some questions, all my life, whether I was a fledgling activist working in television, whether I was a city councillor, which I was for 4 years in Westminster, whether it was as a member of Parliament, which I have been for 30 years, and now as Shadow Home Secretary. All my life, I have fought and struggled around issues of social justice. And I'm quite convinced that in order to move forward on a range of social justice issues, including diversity, we also need to engage with the reality of modern media, and we have to have the strategies through our unions and other organisations to alter that reality and try and move towards a media which is more balanced and diverse, both in the issues it covers, its presenters, but more balanced and diverse in relation to what happens behind the scenes. Because social justice is not a favour that the powerful grant the relatively powerless. Social justice ought to be the aim of all of us. Thank you very much.